Good evening, everyone. I'm Claire O'Keefe, and I'd like to thank you for joining us virtually tonight. And on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm pleased to introduce our event with Larry Tye presenting his new book, Demagogue, The Life and Long Shadow of Senator Joe McCarthy. He'll be in conversation with Tim Naftali. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community and our new digital community during these challenging times. Every week we're hosting events, and as always, our event schedule is available on our website, which is harvard.com/events, where you can sign up for our email newsletter and browse our shelves from home. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk tonight, you can go to the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get through as many of those questions as time allows. After the introduction, I'll drop a link into the chat to purchase Demagogue. And as a special treat tonight, thank you, Larry, the first 20 people who order Demagogue will receive a signed book plate. Your purchases and financial contributions, I'm also going to share a link to donate, are what make this virtual event series possible. And now, more than ever, support the future of a landmark independent bookstore. So thank you for tuning in support of our authors and the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And finally, as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings these last few months, technical issues may arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them quickly. So thank you for your patience and for your understanding. And now I am pleased to introduce our speakers. Larry Tye is the author of more than half a dozen books, including the noted biography, Bobby Kennedy, The Making of a Liberal Icon. You may also be familiar with his work as a reporter at both the Boston Globe and as a fellow at Harvard's Nieman Foundation. He has taught journalism at Boston University, Northeastern, and Tufts, and he runs the Boston-based Health Coverage Fellowship, which helps the media do a better job reporting on critical issues like public health, mental health, and high-tech medicine. He'll be joined in conversation tonight by Timothy Naftali, director of NYU's undergraduate public policy major. Naftali writes on national security, intelligence policy, international history, and presidential history. Tonight, they'll be discussing Larry's new book, Demagogue, The Life and Long Shadow of Senator Joe McCarthy. It's not only a biography of the infamous senator, but also an examination of bullies in American political life. In the Wall Street Journal, Duncan White writes, Larry Tye gives us the fullest account yet of the crusading junior senator from Wisconsin. The rigor of his research ensures he goes far beyond the caricature to give us a portrait of nuance and depth. McCarthy's personality is important because McCarthyism was not an intellectual project. The senator had no program of ideas, no set of policies he wanted to enact. It was always clear what he was against, but never what he was for, other than Joseph R. McCarthy. And Demagogue demonstrates it is not clear that he even knew what his ultimate goal was. It was just more. And so now I'm pleased to turn things over to tonight's speaker. The digital podium is yours, Larry and Tim.
Thank you, Claire. Hello, Larry. And hello, everybody out there. Isn't it wonderful to be working with an independent bookstore? What a delight Harvard Bookstore has always been. And it's great that they're hosting this event. Congratulations, Larry, on a new book. It's a great book.
Thank you, Tim. And speaking of great books, I just want to put in a pitch for Impeachment, Tim's amazingly timely and incredibly insightful book that was just out and formed a backdrop for all the discussion of the big impeachment debate.
Oh, thanks, Larry. I've had some great co-authors, and yes, impeachment came and went. And with the Trump era, we are on to the next, not crisis, but crises. And the pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement are both worthy of our total attention now. And we'll learn later what role impeachment played in the legacy of Donald J. Trump. So let me start with a softball. I love to ask authors why they choose certain topics. I guess the answer is pretty clear, but let me ask you, Larry, after that remarkable book on RFK, why did you choose to write about Joseph R. McCarthy?
So my being intrigued with McCarthy started with an interview that I did with Ethel Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy's widow, where she said she was trying to explain Bobby's early career choice to go work for McCarthy almost immediately after he graduated from law school. And she said, McCarthy may have been a monster in much of America, but to us, he was just plain good fun. And the words good fun aren't exactly what you associate with Joe McCarthy. And I was intrigued by somebody that I had grown up thinking of, part of an iconic couple, Ethel Kennedy, having been so enchanted by Joe McCarthy. I also had a friend who was the longtime historian of the Senate, a guy named Don Ritchie, who had been telling me for years that there were these extraordinary 9,000 pages of transcripts out there that nobody had ever really paid attention to, which were Joe McCarthy when he closed the doors of his hearing room. And for half a century, those transcripts had been embargoed, and now they were public. And the third factor that led me to McCarthy was essentially the week before the election, I had signed up to write a biography of Barack Obama. And the week after the election, it was clear that we wouldn't know Obama's legacy until the era of Trump was over. But it was also clear that a story that looked like ancient history about Joe McCarthy was suddenly the story of today with the election of Donald Trump.
What were the surprises that you found in going back over a story that most of us learned a portion of in high school and to some extent in college?
So there were lots of surprises. The parts of what I found when I was doing this book, I had the luxury of having access to things that all the previous McCarthy biographers hadn't had access to. There were those transcripts that I mentioned, the 9,000 pages. But more importantly, there were a trove of records of all of McCarthy's personal and professional files, which his widow had left 60 years before at his alma mater at Marquette University. And biographers have been asking for those for forever. And I asked for them, and not because I was charming, and Tim, you know me well enough to know that it wasn't my charm that got the family to say you can have access to these. It was some combination of persistence and maybe luck, but they decided to open up those archives and open them in the unusual way of saying, you can have a look, and it's an exclusive look, and when you stop looking, we put them back under lock and key. So McCarthy's personal and professional papers, his transcripts, and all of his military and medical records. And there were two kinds of things that I found with those. One was all the things that made him look even more sinister than we thought. And I'll talk about a couple of those. But first I want to say, I also found a few things that made him look better than history had made him look before. And one of those was around the question of whether McCarthy was a legitimate war hero. When he first ran for Senate in 1944 in an unsuccessful campaign, he dubbed himself Hail Gunner Joe. And he was basically saying that he was a hero up there going out in planes under enemy fire and getting shot at. And the press distrusted anything McCarthy said enough that they made it into a caricature. And NBC actually did an entire hour-long documentary mocking him called Tail Gunner Joe. The assumption was that he was embellishing, if not outright lying, and the assumption was he was anything but a war hero. And what I found in the records was his handwritten diaries, the real-time diaries when he was in the South Pacific, where he went through on a day-by-day basis and said, yes, my official assignment is as a land-based intelligence officer, but I'm actually up there volunteering to fly as a tail gunner. And it wasn't just his diary, but it was letters from all of his squad mates in the South Pacific saying that he was up there with them in the plane under enemy fire. So I think there are two lessons from that. One is if you lie often enough, when you're occasionally telling the truth, nobody is going to believe you. And the other is the puzzle to me on why, if he had all these records in his archives, in his personal files, showing that he was telling the truth, why the heck didn't he tell the world here are my records, and I can prove that I'm the hero that I was. And I think for a politician who was the ultimate in shameless, this may have been the one time in his records of his career and his life that he decided if people didn't believe him about something as elemental as him putting himself at risk to go off and fly as a tail gunner, the heck with them, and he was just going to ignore his critics and his journalistic enemies. And I think I've gone on too long, so I'm going to stop here, and I can tell you more things I found, but you've got better questions.
Well, no, but I want to ask you, if you go back to 1949, right, his Wheeling speech, which sets in motion what we know as McCarthyism, which you describe beautifully, is in early 1950. In 1949, did he have the makings of a monster?
So in 1949, he had the makings of a one-term senator. He was a backbencher. He had done nothing from the time he was elected in 1946 to the time in 1949, the setup for the Wheeling thing. He was not a monster, but he was insignificant. The one thing that he had done probably to that point that truly came closest to suggesting the kind of evil character he would become was when he became part of a process in reviewing what was the deadliest episode for American soldiers in World War II, something called the Malmedy Massacre. And this is when nearly 150 American soldiers who had raised a white flag of surrender were mowed down by a Nazi SS unit. And the ones that they didn't machine gun to death, they used their rifle butts to kill, or they burned out of a cafe where they were trying to take cover. The Army found the perpetrators after the war, they convicted them, they sentenced them to death. And then all kinds of hell broke loose. A bunch of ex-Nazis and journalists and peace activists and one US senator started saying that the proceedings hadn't been fair. And the Senate comes in and investigates and says they in fact were fair. But Joe McCarthy was the only person in Congress who took it upon himself to defend the Nazi perpetrators of this deadly Malmedy massacre. And that suggested two things. One, it suggested how misguided he could be in causes that he took on. And the other is it gave a hint of the fact that Joe McCarthy, in addition to many other labels that he had, might have deserved the label of anti-Semite.
So as 1949 ends, how does he come to choose the red baiting issue to be what he tries to use to be reelected?
So I want to answer that by taking us forward a couple of months to February of 1950. And on February 9th, on the anniversary of Abe Lincoln's birth, every Republican gathering in America tries to use that Lincoln dinner as a way to raise energy and raise money. And if you're a prominent senator, you get invited to places like Washington or New York, like Boston or San Francisco, to deliver the Lincoln Day dinner. When you're Joe McCarthy in February of 1950 and nobody knows who you are, you're invited to a place called Wheeling, West Virginia. And Joe McCarthy shows up there with a briefcase containing two speeches. One speech is a total snoozer on the issue of national housing policy. Now that happened to be something that McCarthy actually knew something about, but if he had picked that speech out of his briefcase that night, 70 years later, you and I wouldn't be here, Tim, talking about Joe McCarthy. But instead, he picked out of his briefcase the other speech, which was a barn burner. And this was a speech where he famously waved in the air a bunch of papers and said, I have in my hand the list of 205 spies at the US State Department. These are Soviet agents. These are people that Harry Truman knows about or should have known about, and they're actually there in the State Department causing lots of havoc. The problem was that we don't know what he had in his hand, but it sure as heck wasn't the list of 205 spies. It may have been recycled names that earlier people, the House Un-American Activities Committee or others had put together. His numbers kept switching, and the other number he favored was 57. And I have a theory that on his way to that dinner that night, he stopped off and had a hamburger, and he poured Heinz 57 sauce on it. And people, his friends would joke later that that's where the number 57 came from. But whatever the origin of the speech and the origin of his numbers were, McCarthy brilliantly understood that that was an era of great fear in America. It was just after the spy trial of the Rosenbergs, the atomic spies. It was just after nationalist China had become Red China. It was just before school children in America would be taught that if there was a nuclear explosion, you should duck and cover under your desk as a way of protecting yourself. Joe McCarthy understood those fears. He understood that the way to play on those fears was not to do what most anti-communists of that era did, which is to charge that there was some general notion of traitorous activity. Joe McCarthy understood that if you named the traitors and you counted them, you were gonna get front page headlines. And within 2 days, McCarthy was on the front page of every newspaper in America. It didn't matter that he knew less about foreign policy and about any communist infiltration than probably anybody in the US Senate. McCarthy was off and running, and he never turned back.
So we're talking a lot about enablers of demagogues these days. Your book shows that Republicans were not happy with the crusade that McCarthy had started. And one gets a sense that a number of them wanted to shut him down and certainly didn't take him seriously. Why didn't they shut him down in early 1950?
So I think half of the key to the McCarthy story is the story of the enablers. And I want to talk briefly about 3 sets of enablers. One are the congressional Republicans that you talked about, and they didn't shut him down because as he was slowly gaining power, they were eager to reclaim the majority in the Senate. And when they finally did that in the elections of 1952, they did it with such a narrow margin that they weren't about to sacrifice that margin by condemning and potentially costing the seat of one of their own members. Democrats, meanwhile, didn't take him on because they watched what happened when their colleague Millard Tydings, a very powerful senator from Maryland, took on Joe McCarthy, called him shortly after the Wheeling speech a fraud and a hoax. And that November, Millard Tydings, who looked like one of the biggest shoo-ins in the Senate in that race, was challenged by a McCarthy candidate. McCarthy raised the money. McCarthy gave him his dirty tricks playbook, and Millard Tydings lost. So the Democrats saw how he could bulldoze his opponents. The Republicans wanted to preserve their majority. And the one person in America after 1952 that had the power to take down Joe McCarthy was Dwight Eisenhower. And I think history has given him a free ride on this thing. It said that he was taking the go slow approach. It said that he had what was famously called a hidden hand, that he was behind the scenes orchestrating opposition to McCarthy. The person who was most convincing in calling out Eisenhower was Dwight's brother, Milton Eisenhower, who from the day Eisenhower was elected president was whispering in his brother's ear, give up some of your popularity, take on that bully. And Eisenhower instead waited 2 years, during which time people's lives and careers were ruined. And I think he was, and this is a horrible thing to say about our war hero president, but in this case, I think he was a coward.
To what extent did the media enable McCarthy?
To an embarrassing extent, as an ex-journalist, to say the extent to which the media was his megaphone and mouthpiece. But McCarthy brilliantly understood the way to play the press. He didn't pick Wheeling just out of the hat in terms of a place to unveil his speech on communists and the government. He understood that if he were to make that same speech, give that same speech in Washington, reporters there, the sophisticated reporters in Washington, would understand instantaneously who to call for comment in the White House and in the State Department. He understood if he gave that speech in the middle of the afternoon, reporters who were covering it would have all day to get comment from the other side. So instead, he gave it in Wheeling, West Virginia, where the reporters were used to covering the Wheeling City Council, but not the State Department. He gave it at night, 5 minutes before their deadline, so that they would have no time to call anybody immediately for comment. And he perpetually, in the next 4.5 years, knew how to play all the press's own rules to manipulate them and work against them. When he could charm them, he charmed them. When the news was bad, he pointed his finger at the newsmen. Sound familiar?
Well, and as we examine the role of a demagogue more recently, we also have been asking ourselves about the attractiveness of the paranoid style in American popular culture. Richard Hofstadter famously wrote about this in 1964, but he was thinking about McCarthyism and later versions of the Red Scare brought up by the John Birch Society. To what extent, how would you explain the attractiveness of McCarthy's paranoid message in 1951 and 52 and 53? What was it that made it so appealing to so many Americans?
So I think it was partly the natural charisma that this guy had, the kind of charm that Ethel Kennedy was talking about. It was partly him reading better than any politician the fear in America. He was not only not the first one to be raising these kinds of charges, but 12 years before, the House Un-American Activities Committee had real communists that they were uncovering and had much better evidence, but they didn't have a Joe McCarthy out there to trumpet this evidence, to play on these fears. And so therefore, instead of the movement being called Dyeism, after Martin Dyes, the powerful chairman of the House Un-American Activities Committee, instead of it being called Trumanism, after Harry Truman, who launched a loyalty program essentially casting doubt on every one of 5 million federal employees, Joe McCarthy may not have had the dope, but he had all the trappings of just how to play on these kinds of fears. He was a smarter guy than history gave him credit for. He was a more opportunistic guy than any of his fans would ever acknowledge. And he picked a perfect moment to raise his charges.
Well, Larry, are we saying that he was especially talented at being the demagogue, or that to some extent the United States was vulnerable, very vulnerable to a demagogue at that point in its history?
So I think we have a long history of a uniquely American strain of demagoguery that begins in our founding days, that continues through guys like Huey Long and Father Coughlin, the Jew-baiting radio priest, and continued on to George Wallace and David Duke and lots of others. And I think that we are vulnerable to demagoguery at any moment. At any moment, there are fears, legitimate fears that Americans are feeling, whether it's economic insecurity, whether it's the threat of the Soviet Union and the bomb. And those threats were there long before Joe McCarthy. And you know so well, with all of your work on the missile crisis and everything else, that those fears persisted long after. But I think there was something magical about the demagogues that I've named, the ones who really mattered in American history. They had a special skill in playing on the fears of their moment. And so I really do think it had a lot to do with the individual character or lack of character of Joe McCarthy.
Let's talk about the team.
By the way, you are so smart and you know this stuff. Do you buy that, or you think it was something about the moment?
Well, I think that that conspiracy theories have circulated through American popular and political culture since our founding. But there are, I think, moments in time when we are particularly vulnerable. And those often are times when people's trust in institutions are especially low. I think Vietnam, I mean, this is of course later, but I think that the Soviet acquisition of nuclear weapons, which though they were difficult, they couldn't quite reach the United States yet. They were building bombers, but they were likely to be able to reach the United States, certainly could once they had missiles, that introduced a peril that many Americans found difficult to understand and accept. This is a country that has long enjoyed almost an invulnerability because of its geographical position. So I think that's one major cause of the vulnerability. The second, of course, is the fear of communism, the fear of people, of othering certain people, particularly, I'm afraid, Jewish Americans. And we'll talk a little bit about people, the LGBTQ community. And I think there's another element, and it's that the Korean War happens in the summer of 1951. The Korean War starts. And I think not that McCarthy would have burnt himself out, but the Korean War, the fact that it was a surprise, the way in which the Truman administration mishandled it twice, both in being surprised and then in being surprised by the North Koreans and then being surprised by the Chinese, I think that deepened a sense of betrayal among many Americans, the betrayal by the Truman administration, and accelerated the attractiveness of McCarthy. So I do think that the times made his megaphone even more powerful. But I wanted to ask you about his team, because McCarthy wasn't quite a one-man band. How important was Roy Cohn to shaping the nature of McCarthyism and its particular poison?
So normally I would say to an audience that I should explain a bit who Roy Cohn was, but I assume given the recent films and this being an incredibly literate group, everybody knows. Roy Cohn was obviously the brilliant and arrogant lawyer from New York who had a successful track record in prosecuting accused communists. And Joe McCarthy recruited him in early 1953 to be his chief counsel, which meant his chief of staff. And Roy Cohn was incredibly important to Joe McCarthy, but doesn't deserve the blame for Joe McCarthy. Roy Cohn essentially reinforced every bad and mean instinct Joe McCarthy had and helped take him, as Bobby Kennedy described it, on a toboggan ride, that all that either of them cared about was it felt great coming down the hill, and the fact there was a tree standing there didn't matter to them at the time. Roy Cohn was also interesting in terms of the choice of Roy Cohn for two reasons. One is that I think one of the reasons McCarthy chose Roy Cohn not just was because he was smart and because he had a track record of going after communists, but because he was Jewish. And it was at a time when McCarthy was being accused in many quarters, rightfully I think, of being an anti-Semite, and Roy Cohn was a fig leaf. Roy Cohn turned out to be a double fig leaf. He was part of McCarthy's crusade against gays at a time when Roy Cohn wasn't out, but Roy Cohn was one of two people that were up for that job, and the other one was Bobby Kennedy. And we can only speculate what would have happened if Roy Cohn had either said no, or if Joe McCarthy had just said, I'm going to pick this second guy instead. Would Bobby Kennedy have become part of the McCarthy legacy, or would he have turned McCarthy around? And I don't think anybody was going to turn McCarthy around. I'm hesitant not to blame Roy Cohn because he was a nasty character, and I'd like to blame him for a lot of things. But Joe McCarthy deserves blame for Joe McCarthy. He was the boss. He was Roy Cohn's tutor, not his equal. And so Roy Cohn's a big piece of the story, and maybe a bigger piece in bringing McCarthy down than in taking him up, because it was Roy Cohn and his pal David Shine's battle with the Army that more than anything led to the Army McCarthy hearings and led to McCarthy's ultimate destruction.
Well, let's talk about that, because this is not just a story of a comet. This is also the story of how a demagogue gets defeated. Who defeated Joe McCarthy?
So that's a great question, especially the way you phrased it. And the truth is clearly that Joe McCarthy defeated Joe McCarthy. And he did it partly by picking the one enemy in America that was too big to bully, and that was the armed services. He took on the Army. They initially caved to him, and then they finally developed a bit of backbone. And Ike finally developed a bit of backbone when his cherished Army was under fire. So at the start of 1954, there were these Army McCarthy hearings to look into McCarthy's charges of saboteurs in the military, to look into the military's charges that Roy Cohn and David Schein and Joe McCarthy were looking for special treatment for David Schein, who was a young military recruit. The Army pleads with Congress to investigate all of this. The Senate decides to set up a series of hearings, which became the most famous hearings to that time in American history, the Army McCarthy hearings. And at the start of those hearings in early 1954, Joe McCarthy's popularity, the Gallup poll told us, was at 50%. 1 in every 2 Americans thought he was doing a great job, and the only more popular political figure in America at that moment was Dwight Eisenhower. In the course of those hearings, the public got day after day to see Joe McCarthy on their TV screens, to see Joe McCarthy with his 5 o'clock shadow, to see Joe McCarthy with his finger pointing, and to see that the Joe McCarthy on their screens was not the hero that they thought he was at the start of the hearings, but he looked more like the town bully. And while history tells us that it was Joe Welch's famous words saying, "Have you no sense of decency, Senator," when McCarthy attacked this Army attorney's young associate, it was in fact the American public wanting to ask precisely that question for months before that set up Joe McCarthy for the crash that he took. At the end of the hearings in August of 1954, that 50% number had plummeted to 34%. McCarthy was out of favor enough with the public that even the US Senate and Republicans in the Senate developed some courage in standing up to him. And by the end of those hearings, the story of Joe McCarthy was all but over.
So the takeaway, at least from that period, was that bullies can get oversaturated. They can get too much television coverage, and that will hurt them.
So the takeaway from that is that my book about Joe McCarthy and the Joe McCarthy story is, while it looks like a story of one of the blackest figures in American political history, I see it as a good news story. And the good news is that given the rope, every demagogue in American history has hung themselves. Given the chance that America, which makes the mistake of buying into and enabling demagogues, eventually sees the wisdom of cutting bait with those demagogues and eventually makes the right decision.
You write about his efforts to rehabilitate himself after the Army McCarthy hearings, and the one place he goes to seeking support is Massachusetts. Why is his base not just in Wisconsin but also in Massachusetts in 1954 and 55?
So there are a couple reasons for that. One is because Massachusetts has one of the highest percents of Catholics of any state in America, and McCarthy's base was always the Catholic community. He was a very faithful Catholic, and he actually, to his credit, never used his faith as a way of advancing his politics. The other was that McCarthy had unusual friends in Massachusetts. Part of the counterintuitive McCarthy story that we talked about at the beginning, the Kennedys were great buddies of his, and this ultimate Cold Warrior actually in many ways helped launch the liberal Kennedy dynasty. And He did that not just by hiring Bobby and becoming his first mentor, but by staying out of Massachusetts when Jack first ran for the Senate, so that he had a clear field to the Catholic vote, rather than having Joe McCarthy come in and campaign for Senator Lodge, the incumbent Republican. And Papa Joe Kennedy had donated enough money to Joe McCarthy that when he told Joe McCarthy to stay out of Massachusetts and let Jack have a clear shot at that race, Joe McCarthy stayed out. When he told Joe McCarthy, hire Bobby, Joe McCarthy hired Bobby. And when he told Joe McCarthy, come to Cape Cod and enjoy our brilliant beaches and enjoy dating my two daughters, Eunice and Patricia, Joe McCarthy did that too. And McCarthy had a special fondness for the Kennedys and for the state of Massachusetts.
I just wanted to be clear, but he didn't have a special affection for liberals.
No, he had no affection for liberals after his first race for office. When McCarthy first ran for office back in the 1930s, and he was running for district attorney in the rural part of Wisconsin that he came from, he ran not just as a Democrat, he ran as an FDR, New Deal loving liberal Democrat. The problem was you couldn't get elected that way in rural Wisconsin. So sometime in the middle of the night when nobody was paying attention, he went in and changed his party registration. And when he ran for Senate in 1946, it wasn't just as a Republican, it was as the representative of the most conservative wing called stalwarts of the Wisconsin Public Republican Party. So his love for liberals was long in his past.
Well, Larry, would it be fair to say that he had no core values? If he could that easily switch from being the standard bearer of liberal Democrats to being the candidate of the far right Republicans, one gets the sense there wasn't any core there. Did he believe anything?
So ironically, he was on the one hand one of the greatest opportunists, and he was willing to flip or flop or do whatever it took to be elected. And his watchword was the words, whatever it takes. And I think that was what he did through most of his career. And he sure as heck didn't believe that he had a list in his hand of 205 or any other communists. And yet, in the course of those 4.5 years, he won over half of America and maybe more to believing that he was a legitimate anti-communist hero. In the end, however, after the Army McCarthy hearings and after McCarthy took his big crash, most of America no longer believed in him. But I'm convinced by that point, Joe McCarthy was a true believer in the cause. And maybe just by mind-numbingly repeating the anti-communist catchphrases that he had repeated so many times, he convinced himself. But whatever it was, starts out as pure opportunist and ironically and sadly ends up believing in a cause that's not real.
Before we turn to questions, I just want to ask you two things. One, what is the role of alcohol in his behavior and in the strategic choices he ultimately makes?
So I want to tell you a very quick story. And one morning, my wife and I are out for a walk very early in the morning on Cape Cod with the dog, and we see an enormous box at the head of our driveway. No idea what it is. I insisted we continue on with the walk, and it would be there when we got back. The box turned out to be papers I'd been asking for 2 years, which were all of McCarthy's medical records from Bethesda Naval Hospital. The official cause of death of Joe McCarthy from the coroner, and as reported in every newspaper around the world, was acute hepatitis. The true cause of his death was alcoholism. He had the DTs. At the very end, his fever was spiking to 107, and he died of the effects of alcohol poisoning. He was an alcoholic throughout his career. After his censure by the Senate at the end of 1954, he became a scary alcoholic. And those medical records detail in tragic form and telling detail just how much he was drinking and how it was killing him.
And lastly, why did he include homosexuals among the groups that he went after with such ferocity?
So I think he included, it was gay men that he was including, and I think he included them for the same reasons he included Jews and leftists, and it was that they made an easy scapegoat. And he was looking for anything that could rally support. America was anti-gay enough at that point that it was guaranteed support. And ironically, the basis that he used for justifying his gay bashing campaign was that closeted homosexuals were a security threat to America because they were vulnerable to being blackmailed by Soviet operatives. And the truth was, if there was anybody in America that was vulnerable to blackmail in those days, it was the avid gambler, the alcoholic, Joe McCarthy, who had more secrets in his closet than anybody.
We've gotten a few questions, and I hope we'll get some more questions from those who are watching. What role, I'd like to talk a little, I had a question about the role of Catholicism, and I wanted you to share with those viewing the story of Father Walsh, and the role that perhaps Father Walsh of Georgetown may have played in focusing Joe McCarthy on the issue of communists in government.
So that's one of these wonderful legends that's out there about how McCarthy came to the cause, that it was Father Walsh who said, like many of the Catholic leaders of that time, was anti-communist, who said, Joe McCarthy, here's your issue. And that famous dinner that they had led McCarthy to his anti-communist crusade. That is one of about 10 origin stories. Joe told different versions of it. Roy Cohn told different versions. And I believe that the dinner happened, and I believe that that absolutely is not what shaped Joe McCarthy's anti-communism. He had given little notice speeches about anti-communism before that dinner in earlier campaigns that he ran. And I think it was that last minute decision in Wheeling rather than any blessing by Father Walsh or anybody else who set him on the path. And it was the fact that it worked that kept him on that path.
Do we know whether McCarthy took note of previous efforts to root out communists in popular culture as well as the U.S. government? I mean, did he make any comment about the Hollywood 10, for example?
So he absolutely knew about the efforts of the House Un-American Activities Committee, and he tried to borrow their files. He knew about the Hollywood 10. He knew what the FBI was doing, and he had, when I looked through those office files of his, I saw all kinds of documents stamped top secret and top secret, making clear that he was being leaked things by the CIA and the FBI and others. Having said all of that, Joe McCarthy was a brilliant guy. Joe McCarthy completed 4 years of high school work in a single year. But Joe McCarthy had absolutely no sense of American history. He had no real clue of all the things that had come before in terms of any really substantive campaign to root out communists. And if he had known, he would have known that all the 24-carat spies were long gone by the time he began his crusade.
Well, now let's talk a bit about that, because there's no doubt that there were Soviet agents in U.S. government at one point, certainly in World War II. But did you find any evidence that Joe McCarthy knew about what the FBI had discovered, knew about the Vanona Project, which was called, I think at that point, Bride? It was the breaking of Soviet intelligence ciphers that had been recorded, that had been copied during the war, but they were broken afterwards and did lead to certain important cases, certain leads. This is happening in the late 40s and early 50s. Did you find any evidence that McCarthy knew about the serious counter-espionage work that was being done by the US government to root out Soviet agents?
So I found evidence to the contrary. I spent a lot of time with a guy that you know, a historian, an expert on Vanona named John Haynes, and his pal Harvey Clare and others, and went back and tried to compare all the Vanona records with the names that McCarthy was raising. And there were a handful that McCarthy raised who were on the Vanona lists and who the Soviets were telling us through their own cables were spies. But generally the people McCarthy was naming had been named by others before them, were low-level operatives, or were union organizers and other leftists. If he had had good names, he was perpetually challenged by the press to come up with just one really top-notch spy. And every time he would name somebody and say, they're the top spy, he called Owen Lattimore the top spy at the State Department, he'd just get everything wrong. And the people often weren't still working at the agency he said they were. And just, it was sad. And I wanted evidence. I wanted to be able to say, McCarthy may not have gotten it all right, but he at least got all of these people right. And there just wasn't good evidence that he came up with anybody that really mattered.
Larry, what was J. Edgar Hoover's approach to McCarthy?
It was a brilliant approach that said a whole lot about Hoover. When McCarthy was on his rise, Hoover was his great buddy. They went out to dinner together. Hoover took McCarthy to the racetrack with him. He leaked and had his people leaking him extraordinary files. But as McCarthy started to bottom out, Hoover cut bait. Hoover survived with all the presidents that Hoover survived under by being an extraordinary politician who could read presidential tea leaves. And when Truman and Ike really got upset with McCarthy and therefore got upset with Hoover, who they knew was leaking, Hoover covered his tracks and stopped leaking. Hoover also investigated lots of charges about McCarthy himself, including charges that McCarthy didn't just hire the gay Roy Cohn, but that Joe McCarthy himself was gay. And there was no solid evidence in any of those charges, and I only raised those charges because Joe McCarthy was raising charges about everybody else. And it was just Hoover investigating people McCarthy was sending his way to investigate at the same time he's investigating Senator McCarthy himself.
So ironically, at a certain point, McCarthy was making counter-espionage look bad.
So ironically, at a certain point, the only thing that communists and anti-communists in America could agree on, that Joe McCarthy was a pox on their houses. And I think the serious anti-communists from that era and afterwards realized that Joe McCarthy did more harm than good for their movement.
Let's talk a little bit more about the Kennedys, since they appear in this book and you've written an important book on Bobby. What was Bobby's view? What was Robert Kennedy's view of McCarthy, and how did it evolve?
So before I answer that question, I just want to say one thing about Tim Naftali. He is, in a way, the gift that keeps on giving, at least for me. And he helped me with my book on Bobby Kennedy. He helped me do a very fun talk at the Nixon Presidential Library that he used to run. He helped me by doing a blurb on the Joe McCarthy book. And he's now helping me tonight by asking these very fun questions. And now I'm going to forget, it was what the last question was about Bobby Kennedy.
It's so much fun, it was forgettable. But actually, it's building on the way you opened. Thank you very much, by the way. It's a pleasure. It's fun to work with great colleagues. You started tonight by telling a story about something that Ethel Kennedy had said to you, okay? About McCarthy being fun, right? And that's jarring to hear. It would have been jarring to hear in the 50s. It's certainly jarring to hear this many decades later. So I asked you, how did Bobby Kennedy's view of Joe McCarthy evolve? What did he think of him?
I think Bobby Kennedy's view evolved by him telling himself a story that wasn't true, that he understood that McCarthy was going to come to a bad ending, But instead of blaming that on Joe McCarthy, who's the one he should have blamed it on, he blamed it on Roy Cohn. And that was convenient, partly because Bobby Kennedy and the Kennedy family, everything about Roy Cohn was anathema to them, including his being gay. And Bobby and Roy Cohn hated one another. And so it was easy to blame McCarthy on Cohn. Bobby also left McCarthy before he came crashing down and actually went to work with the Democrats on the other side of the same committee and helped write the censure report that got McCarthy condemned and ended his chance at doing anything. And yet, because of who Bobby Kennedy was, and he was somebody who was exceedingly loyal to friends, when Joe McCarthy was buried, all of these Republicans rushed to Wisconsin to be part of the services. One lone Democrat showed up there, and that was Bobby Kennedy. He came despite the fact that his big brother Jack said, "Don't go." He hid himself up in the choir loft during the church service. He hid himself at the graveside service way off to the side, away from all the other dignitaries. And after the service, he went up to all the reporters who were there, who in classic form, in the way press covered things like back then, were gonna name every dignitary who was at the funeral. And he begged them not to include his name. He said, "You're gonna get me in trouble with my big brother Jack if you name me." So they left him out. And the story of his being at the funeral was told to me 50 years after the fact by one of those reporters who wanted to do penance for having left Bobby Kennedy's name out of a story he should have been in. And he said Bobby was there and he was loyal, but he was also loyal to his brother.
Remarkable. When you were talking about censure, his brother did not vote to censure Senator McCarthy, as you know.
He didn't. Jack Kennedy wrote a famous book called Profiles in Courage, and his not only unwillingness to vote, but his unwillingness to pair his vote with somebody who wasn't going to be there for the vote, who was taking the opposite position, or his unwillingness to tell us how he would have voted. He blamed his not being there on a bad back, and he had a bad back and he did have back surgery. But that was a total excuse because lots of people weren't going to be there for the actual vote. And Jack Kennedy copped out. He didn't want to alienate liberal Democrats. He didn't want to alienate Catholics who liked McCarthy back home. And Eleanor Roosevelt, for one, never forgave Kennedy for not taking a stand on Joe McCarthy.
I've have sort of come to the conclusion that the Profiles in Courage project was JFK's penance for lacking courage at that point, because he writes it afterwards.
I'm going to read it in your book.
Well, let me put it this way. He doesn't write it. He works closely with Ted Sorensen in a very, very close editorial collaboration. In any case, the book project Profiles in Courage, I think, is a product of him lacking courage over the McCarthy issue. But that's my conclusion. We'll see
I love that.
if I'm right.
Buy it.
We'll see. Larry, have I elicited all of the vignettes, the anecdotes, the pearls that you wanted to share tonight?
So you're too much of a gentleman and a diplomat to have pointed me in the direction of Trump and talking about the analogies to what's going on today. And I don't really want to talk about that because I left Trump out of the book except in the preface and the epilogue. But I want to say just one thing about that, which is every day when I was doing research on this book, and every day when I was reading news clippings from the 1940s and 1950s, I would have trouble remembering at different points during that day whether what I was reading was from that day's newspapers or what had happened 70 years before. And I believe everybody who's writing a book today wants to link it to contemporary events and to Donald Trump. I believe that I don't have to do that because the McCarthy story so reeks of what is going on today in Washington, and because there was a flesh and blood through line from Joe McCarthy with his protege Roy Cohn to Donald Trump with his tutor, Roy Cohn. And I think that Cohn passed on to McCarthy the lessons that he had learned, passed on to Trump the lessons he had learned from McCarthy. And Donald Trump says repeatedly today, I wish I had Roy Cohn covering my back.
Let's leave our listeners or viewers with perhaps a bit of optimism. Why did McCarthyism disappear?
So
Not McCarthy, McCarthyism.
Yes, McCarthy disappeared. It took a lot longer for McCarthyism to disappear, but it never did. And that's the point of my book. It's a one-word title, Demagogue, and it suggests there were people who came before, there were bullies and demagogues who came after. But the first line of my book is, this is a book about America's love affair with bullies. And that's what it is, and we will continue to have that love affair. One hopes that as we understand our history and understand Joe McCarthy's history, we will be better at recognizing the playbook of the demagogue, but we'll never forego it entirely. And hopefully we will never have to live as long as 4.5 years like we did with Joe McCarthy with a powerful demagogue like that.
Larry, thank you. I hope everyone listening enjoyed this as much as I have, and good luck with the book. You deserve all good things.
Tim, you've been great. Thank you very much. And back to our sponsor.
Thank you so much to Larry and to Tim for an amazing conversation and for your kind words at the beginning about the bookstore. And thank you to everyone out there watching for tuning in with us tonight with Harvard Bookstore and spending your evening with us. You can learn more about Larry's book and books in the past and Tim's books on our website, which is harvard.com. And so on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, have a great night, keep reading, wear a mask, and be well. Have a good night.
Bye.
Bye.